My lawyer told me I'd walk away with nothing. The morning she said that, she was smiling. By the time she figured out what I'd actually done, she'd already signed the papers. My name doesn't matter much to this story. What matters is that I spent 22 years building a life with a woman I loved, and somewhere in the middle of all that building, she decided the foundation wasn't good enough anymore. Or maybe it was never about the foundation. Maybe it was about the man she met at her company's regional conference in Denver 2 years ago. I found out about him on a Tuesday. I didn't say a word until the following spring. Let me back up. My wife, I'll call her Regina because that's her name and she's earned every letter of it, was the kind of woman who walked into a room and immediately understood the power dynamics at play. She was smart, genuinely smart, the kind of smart that made her dangerous when her interests shifted away from yours. We met in our late 20s, got married at 32, built a home in Raleigh, North Carolina, near the lake where her parents used to take her as a kid. She said it felt like coming home every time she turned into our driveway. For a long time, I believed her. We had a good life. I ran a small but profitable commercial landscaping company that I'd started from a single truck and a handshake deal with a strip mall manager back in 2004. By the time any of this happened, I had 14 employees, 3 contracts with a regional hospital network, and a name in the community that I'd earned, the slow, honest way. Regina worked in corporate logistics, traveled a lot, made good money. We were partners in the real sense of the word. At least, I thought we were. The conference in Denver was a 3-day thing in October. I remember because I drove her to the airport on a Friday morning and she kissed me on the cheek and said she'd bring me back those caramel popcorn tins from the airport gift shop that I liked. She did bring them back. She also brought back something she never told me about. I didn't discover it in some dramatic way. No lipstick on a collar, no suspicious text left open on the counter. It was quieter than that. About 6 months after Denver, I noticed she'd started putting her phone face down whenever I walked into a room. Not every time. Just enough times that the pattern registered. I'm a detail-oriented person by trade. You don't keep 14 guys employed and 3 hospital contracts running without learning to notice patterns. I didn't confront her. I want to be clear about that decision, because it matters to everything that came after. I chose not to confront her because I'd seen what happens when you play your cards too early. I'd watched my older brother blow up a divorce settlement by losing his temper at the wrong moment, and I'd watched his ex-wife walk away with half of a business he'd built alone. I was not going to make the same mistake. Instead, I called my college roommate, a man I'll call Garrett. Garrett had been a family law attorney in Charlotte for almost 20 years. We played golf together twice a year, and I'd never once asked him for legal advice. I called him on a Wednesday afternoon for my truck, parked in the lot of a hardware store, engine running. I said, I need to ask you something hypothetical. He said, hypotheticals have a way of becoming very real, very fast. Ask anyway. I told him what I suspected. I told him about the company, the contracts, the equipment, the property. I told him about the shop building I owned outright that I'd bought before the marriage. I told him about my father's land up in the western part of the state, 40 acres of mountain timber that had been in our family since 1962. Garrett listened without interrupting, which told me he understood the weight of what I was describing. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Come see me. Don't say anything to her yet. Come see me first." I drove to Charlotte that Friday. Garrett's office was in a building downtown that had no signage on the street level. Just a directory in the lobby, brass letters on cream paper. His partner's name was listed first, Hargrove and Wills, family law. I took the elevator to the 4th floor and sat in a chair that cost more than my first truck and told Garrett everything I knew. He took notes in a yellow legal pad with a pen that looked like it had been gifted at some retirement dinner 30 years ago. By the end of that meeting, I understood 2 things clearly. First, the company I'd built before the marriage was partially mine alone, but years of commingled marital finances had muddied that water considerably. Second, my father's land, the 40 acres, the cabin, the timber rights, was inheritable property that had never been converted to marital use. If I had documentation to prove that, it was protected. "Do you have documentation?" Garrett asked. "My father left a will," I said, "and I never once put her name on that deed." "Then we have something to work with," he said. "But you need to start documenting everything. Now, not tomorrow." I drove home that evening and made dinner. Regina came home at 7, poured herself a glass of wine, and told me about her day. I listened. I smiled at the right times. I asked a follow-up question about a project she'd mentioned a week before. Because that was the kind of husband I'd been, and I wasn't about to change my behavior now. After she went to bed, I sat at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad of my own and started writing down everything I could remember about the finances, the assets, the accounts, the years. What followed was 4 months of the most deliberate patience I have ever exercised in my life. I gathered bank statements. I located my father's will, the original deed transfer, every property tax record going back to the year I inherited the land. I documented the shop building's purchase date and the premarital account it had been paid from. Garrett referred me to a forensic accountant named Patricia, a small, sharp-eyed woman who worked out of a converted Victorian house in Concord and who looked at our joint financial records the way a surgeon looks at an X-ray. Calmly, precisely, without emotion, Patricia found things I hadn't even thought to look for. Business account transactions. The way certain expenses had been categorized over the years. She built a picture of what was mine, what was ours, and what the distinction meant legally. She charged me $3,000 and told me it was the best investment I'd ever make in a courtroom. She wasn't wrong. All of this was happening while Regina and I were still living in the same house, eating dinners together, watching television on Sunday nights, living the surface of a life that had quietly come apart somewhere underneath. In March, she told me she wanted a divorce. She sat across from me at the kitchen table on a Saturday morning, coffee in hand, and she said it the way you might tell someone you're thinking about repainting the living room. Matter of fact. Decided. She said she'd been unhappy for a long time, and she thought we both deserved the chance to find something better. She did not mention Denver. She did not mention the man whose name I'd figured out 4 months earlier. I did not bring either of those things up. I said, if that's what you want, we'll figure it out. She looked almost disappointed. I think she'd expected something louder. 3 days later, she posted something on Facebook. I only saw it because my cousin texted me a screenshot with a single question mark. Regina had written a long post about choosing yourself and refusing to shrink, and near the end she'd added a line that said, "And for anyone wondering, I promise you, I'm the one who's going to be just fine." Several of her friends commented with heart emojis and phrases like "queen behavior" and "she's unbothered." Her sister wrote, "You've got this. He doesn't know what he's losing." I read that last line twice. Then I put my phone down and went to check on one of my hospital contract sites, because we had a spring planting job starting that week and 2 of my guys had called in sick. Regina's attorney was a man named Clifford, who had a reputation in Raleigh for being aggressive in asset division cases. I'd heard his name before, the way you hear names in a mid-sized city. At Chamber of Commerce events, through clients, that sort of thing. Regina had clearly done her homework. Clifford sent a letter to Garrett within 2 weeks of her filing. And from what Garrett described to me afterward, the opening position was ambitious. They wanted a share of the company. They wanted the mountain property. They wanted the shop building. Garrett called me after he read that letter and said, "They think they have more than they do." "Let them think that," I said. The discovery process was where the work I'd done over those 4 months started to matter. Patricia's documentation laid out the premarital origins of the shop building clearly enough that Clifford's team dropped that claim within the first 60 days. The mountain property required more back and forth. Clifford argued that improvements made to the cabin during the marriage, a new roof, updated plumbing, constituted marital investment that created an interest. Garrett had anticipated this argument. We had the receipts for that work, paid from a separate account, and we had a property appraiser who testified to the pre-improvement value versus post. The argument didn't hold. The company was the most complicated piece. 22 years of marriage, 20 years of business. There was genuine entanglement there, and I won't pretend otherwise. What Patricia's work established, though, was the clear documentation of what had existed before the marriage and the trajectory of growth that was traceable to specific contracts and decisions I had made independently. Garrett negotiated hard. There were 3 mediation sessions over the course of 2 months. Regina's attorney kept adjusting his position. Garrett didn't. At the second mediation session, I sat across a conference table from Regina for the first time in the entire process. She had her attorney beside her. I had Garrett. There was a mediator named Carl, who had the energy of a man who had seen every version of this particular room, and none of it surprised him anymore. Regina looked across the table at me at one point and said, "I just want what's fair." I said, "So do I." That was the only direct exchange we had that day. By the third session, the shape of the settlement had become clear. She would receive a portion of the marital equity in the house, her own retirement accounts, and a settlement figure that Garrett and I had agreed was reasonable, given the actual marital assets at stake. The mountain property was excluded entirely. The shop building was excluded. The company was valued and a portion of its marital period appreciation went into the settlement calculation. But the business itself remained mine. It wasn't nothing. I'm not going to pretend it didn't cost me. It cost me real money and real time, and a significant portion of a year I won't get back. But when Clifford's original position is compared to where we ended up, the distance between those 2 points is the direct result of 4 months of quiet preparation and a forensic accountant in a Victorian house in Concord. The papers were signed on a Thursday morning in April. It rained. Garrett and I walked out of the attorney's office and stood under the awning for a minute while he checked his phone, and I looked out at the parking lot. There was a dogwood tree along the edge of the lot just starting to bloom. My father had planted a dogwood in the yard the year I was born. I don't know why I thought of that right then. Garrett said, "You handled that well." I said, "I had a good teacher." He said, "Call me for golf in June." I drove back to Raleigh, went directly to one of my job sites, where a crew was finishing the spray install for one of the hospital entrances. There were tulips going in along the main walkway, yellow and white, and 2 of my guys were working the border trim with a precision that told me they'd been paying attention. I stood there for probably 10 minutes, just watching them work. It struck me, standing there, that the thing I was most grateful for wasn't the settlement outcome. It was that I still had something to come back to. The truck, the crews, the contracts, the work itself, 20 years of showing up every day, had built something that couldn't be undone in a conference room. I want to say something about the man from Denver, because I've thought about it a lot since then. I found out, through the ordinary course of social media and mutual acquaintances, that Regina and he had stopped seeing each other sometime during the divorce process. I don't know the details, and I genuinely don't want them. What I know is that she had been willing to burn down 22 years for something that didn't last the length of a court proceeding. That's a grief that belongs to her, not to me, and I'm not interested in what she does with it. There were people in my life, good people, people who cared about me, who wanted me to be angrier than I was. My brother called me the week after the papers were signed and said, "Are you sure you're okay? You don't seem angry enough." I told him I'd had a year to process the anger, and I'd processed most of it alone in my truck in a hardware store parking lot. By the time the papers were signed, I was mostly just tired. My cousin, the one who'd sent me the screenshot of Regina's Facebook post, asked me if I'd seen that she'd taken the post down. I hadn't. I told him it didn't matter much to me either way. He said, "Don't you want to post something?" I told him no. I had nothing to prove to an audience that hadn't been in the room. The thing about preparing quietly is that the results speak without you having to say a word. I've thought about what I'd tell someone in the position I was in 2 years ago, sitting in that truck with the engine running, trying to figure out what to do next. Here's what I came to. The most important decision I made in that entire process was the decision not to react, not to call her out, not to blow up, not to let my anger write checks that my evidence couldn't cash. I had something to protect. Protecting it required me to think before I felt, which is not natural for me, and probably isn't natural for me, and probably isn't natural for most people. But it was worth it. Every quiet evening, every dinner where I smiled and asked follow-up questions, every Saturday morning I spent in Garrett's office or on the phone with Patricia instead of out on the lake, it was worth it. My father used to say that the land would outlast everything that happened on it. He said that about the 40 acres, about the timber, about the cabin where I spent summers as a boy. He meant it as a comfort, that the permanent things stay permanent. Standing outside Garrett's office in the rain that Thursday morning, I understood something else in it too. The things you build with your hands and your time and your consistency, those things don't disappear because someone decides they're done with you. You just have to know which ones to protect. And then you have to do the quiet, unglamorous work of protecting them. That's the whole story. The tulips are in bloom again this spring. The crews are working. The mountain is still there.